Lightning streaked across the twilight sky as I first noticed the monumental steel arches rising beyond my property line. My heart pounded with a mix of unease and curiosity, because no one had asked permission to build anything near my family's old homestead. Hello, friends, and welcome to my extraordinary tale of grit, heritage, and unexpected alliances. If you were in my shoes, what would you do if someone brazenly constructed a massive bridge on your land? Comment your thoughts. Now step with me into this story, because everything you think you know is about to be turned upside down. I had no idea that the looming silhouette belonged to the local homeowners association, or HOA, notorious for heavy-handed rules and domineering tactics. Our family's land, tucked away behind age-old oaks, had always remained untouched by the creeping wave of development. Grandfather left this property to me with one simple instruction: protect what he had built with his own two hands. Yet, on this particular evening, the frightening rumble of construction equipment shattered the peaceful hush of dusk. Something enormous was taking shape. In disbelief, I rushed inside, my mind whirling with questions, unaware that this was just the start. That night, sleep eluded me, drowned out by the clang and drone echoing through the darkness. Come morning, the sun's first rays revealed a half-finished metal framework spanned across a shallow valley on my property. Right at its base stood a cluster of people in matching polo shirts, bearing the HOA logo. They seemed triumphant, as if this structure signified their ultimate power move. My stomach twisted. This land was never part of their official boundaries. Yet, they were building a bridge that connected two separate residential areas, using my property like a convenient corridor. I felt cornered, furious, helpless. I grabbed my phone and hurried outside. The breeze rustled through the branches overhead, a gentle reminder that nature had always been my fortress. Still, the glare of steel marred the tranquil view. I approached the small group, heart pounding against my ribs, determined to figure out why they believed they could do this. My voice shook with pent-up frustration as I confronted them. One of the men, sporting a name tag that read Damon, offered a dismissive grin. He explained that the HOA had approved a massive project to unite two gated communities, and my land was in their path. As I demanded to see legal documents or city permits, Damon flipped through a stack of papers. He insisted everything was proper and that I'd somehow been notified in advance. My protests met condescending shrugs. Another woman in the group, Linda, chimed in that building the bridge was beneficial for everyone in the region. She claimed traffic would decrease, local property values would soar, and the entire neighborhood would elevate. None of that mattered to me, because they had brazenly ignored the sacred boundary of my grandfather's land. I stood there, fists clenching, determined to resist but lacking a strategy. Later that day, I retreated inside my old farmhouse, shutting the door against the tumult of construction noise. Dust drifted through the air, illuminated by the slivers of light streaming through the curtains. I sank into grandfather's worn leather armchair, the weight of his memory pushing me to stand up for what was right. My mind raced. Could it be a misunderstanding, or was it a calculated land grab orchestrated by powerful people? Either way, I suspected the HOA never expected real pushback. They probably thought I would cave in, take some hush money, and let them do whatever they wanted. I remembered grandfather's stories about how he had once fought city planners to keep a historic oak from being cut down decades ago. He had defied them, gathering support from neighbors and eventually forcing the city to change its plans. That oak still stood near the creek, its gnarled roots and sweeping branches a silent testament to his perseverance. It reminded me that the only way to protect something important was to fight with determination and cunning. I wasn't a legal expert and I didn't own an army of bulldozers, but I had the will to honor grandfather's legacy. Standing up, I opened the weathered trunk in the corner of the living room. Inside lay decades' worth of family documents, photographs, and letters. Maybe I could find some clue about the land's boundary lines, an official deed or a map that would prove the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property. Hours ticked by as I sifted through dusty envelopes, reading grandfather's notes scribbled on yellowed paper. This search had me recalling childhood memories of him showing me hidden corners of the farm, whispering about secrets only our family knew. I prayed he had left behind something that could still protect us. Meanwhile, the hammering outside intensified. Beams of metal clanged against each other, and the roar of heavy machinery thundered across the fields. My frustration grew with each passing moment, but I refused to give in to despair. A faint memory flickered in the back of my mind. Grandfather once mentioned a hidden talisman of sorts, some intangible protection for the land. At the time, I thought it was an exaggerated story. Now I was desperate to figure out if he had referred to a legal document. I wondered if that intangible charm might be an ironclad deed or a special clause. Night fell again. This time, I forced myself to slip outside, creeping through the darkness toward the construction zone. Floodlights turned the site into a glaring spectacle of machinery, shadows, dancing along piles of steel and wood. Workers bustled around, apparently trying to accelerate the schedule. Why the rush? A sense of urgency seemed to permeate the whole crew. A security guard stood at the perimeter, so I snuck around the southern edge, using the tree line for cover. From that vantage point, I saw the extent of the project. It was more massive than I'd initially realized. The bridge spanned at least half a mile, crossing the creek and scarring the land. My heart sank. I thought of grandfather telling me that all living things on this property were connected. The creek nourished the oaks, which sheltered the wildlife, and in turn our farm thrived symbiotically. Now this steel monster threatened to disrupt the harmony. I spent an hour watching, noticing how the workers systematically positioned each segment. My anger simmered, but I also felt an odd determination rising within me. If I could find a way to halt this construction, or prove it illegal, I would. By dawn, I'd only managed a few hours of fitful rest. Resolved to investigate further, I drove into town. The local planning office was a small, beige building that smelled of stale coffee and file folders. A bored clerk, Sam, sat behind the counter. When I asked about the HOA's bridge project, he checked his computer and rummaged through filing cabinets. Sam frowned, explaining that the city had granted approval for a pedestrian walkway, not a huge bridge suitable for vehicles. Something wasn't right. The permit was for limited development and only if the landowner consented. According to the documents, that landowner was me. My heart leapt. I hadn't signed anything. Sam shrugged, pointing to a scanned form with an illegible signature. Someone had forged my name or tricked the city. Furious, I requested copies of everything. Sam mentioned that HOAs frequently pulled stunts, but this scale was outlandish. He advised me to get legal counsel, but I knew I'd have to build a case from the ground up. My next step was the county records office, an old stone building with squeaky floors and fluorescent lights. There I hoped to uncover the original deed to the property, which might hold details about restrictions. After some digging, I located the official deed from grandfather's era. It was more comprehensive than I'd expected, featuring coordinates and references to earlier documents. In a marginal note, grandfather had jotted down cryptic lines about preserving ingress and egress rights for the family, should any major construction threaten the creek. Intrigued, I scanned further. Another passage indicated that the property included a conservation easement, stipulating that the land could not be used for large-scale structural developments without explicit permission from the deed holder, namely, me. This was the leverage I needed. Now I just had to wield it properly. Returning home, I spread the files across the dining table. The house felt eerily quiet, the hum of bulldozers outside nearly drowned out by the thick walls. I read over the documents multiple times, then decided to question the construction foreman directly. Marching down the dirt path, I spotted the foreman barking orders at a crane operator. I waved him over, explaining calmly that I was the property owner. He looked puzzled but tried to remain professional. I showed him copies of the permit and the deed, pointing out the discrepancies. He scratched his head, stammering that he was merely hired by the HOA. It's their project, he insisted, wiping sweat from his brow. We assumed everything was legit. That didn't surprise me. Big organizations often hired third-party contractors who knew nothing of the behind-the-scenes politics. However, his reaction told me the HOA might have concealed crucial details from everyone, including the contractors. I asked for contact information of anyone in charge. He hesitated, then handed me a business card for Damon, the same man I'd met earlier. My blood boiled. Damon had presented himself as a mere HOA representative, but apparently he wielded significant control over the entire operation. Armed with new clarity, I returned to my house. I typed out a formal cease and desist letter citing the deed's clauses and the suspicious permit. My hands trembled. Though I was no lawyer, I'd done enough research to craft a compelling argument. At the end, I demanded they halt all construction until the legal issues were resolved. I printed copies and drove to the nearest post office, sending them by certified mail to Damon and the HOA board. Admittedly, I felt a little proud. It wasn't a magical bullet, but it was my first official shot across the bow. Within days, the HOA responded with a short dismissive letter. They claimed I'd given implied consent by failing to contest the project earlier. Fury raged inside me. I hadn't even been aware of the project until it literally appeared on my property. Undeterred, I fired back another letter, referencing the forged signature on record at the planning office. Meanwhile, the clang of construction outside continued unabated. Each day, more beams rose from the ground, the structure expanding like a metal spiderweb. People from the two housing developments strolled by, gawking at my protests as if I were the troublemaker. Friends in town began hearing rumors that I was blocking progress and that the bridge was essential to local improvement. The HOA's spin machine was effective. They painted me as a stubborn landowner refusing to accept modernization. That stung, especially when acquaintances asked why I hated the community. My phone buzzed with messages, some supportive, others accusing me of being selfish. The emotional toll weighed on me, but I refused to let public opinion derail my search for justice. My resolve hardened. I would preserve my grandfather's legacy, no matter how many people the HOA manipulated with their rhetoric. One evening, I received an unexpected visitor at my door. It was a neighbor from the outskirts of the HOA territory, a retired teacher named Mrs. Patterson. She had spotted shady behavior around the permit process as well. "People around here are scared to speak up," she confided, eyes darting nervously. She felt the HOA was unstoppable and wielded an iron grip on community politics. After hearing my story, Mrs. Patterson offered me a folder of documents she'd collected on other questionable HOA projects. Some indicated that the association had expanded its boundaries multiple times, often without explicit neighborhood votes. Her willingness to share proved that I wasn't alone. We pored over the documents by the dim glow of a kitchen lamp. Something clicked in my mind when I saw a pattern. The HOA had systematically annexed nearby properties that were never intended to be part of their regime. In each instance, they claimed it was for beautification or connectivity, but the real motive appeared to be power. They'd racked up additional fees from newly absorbed properties, exerted influence over local zoning decisions, and formed alliances with certain officials. It was no wonder they believed they could build on my land. At that moment, my phone rang. The unknown number turned out to be Linda, the HOA woman who had previously spoken about the so-called benefits of the bridge. In a strained tone, she asked if I'd be open to a friendly negotiation. That alone was suspicious. Nonetheless, I agreed to meet her at a local coffee shop the next day. A sleepless night followed as I debated whether I should trust anything Linda said. Still, if there was a chance to reach a settlement or at least glean some vital intel, it was worth hearing her out. Early in the morning, I arrived at the cafe. Linda sat in a corner booth, sipping a cappuccino. She looked tired, her usual polished demeanor replaced by a more anxious energy. We exchanged stilted pleasantries. She cut straight to the point. "The HOA is willing to compensate you for the land that the bridge occupies." I pressed for details. She offered a sum of money that, frankly, wasn't trivial, but I could sense an underlying desperation. I calmly replied that money wasn't the issue. The property was a family heritage site, and I wasn't willing to simply sell out. She tried to sweeten the deal, offering me a seat on the HOA board if I complied. That offer made me want to laugh. The thought of sitting on the board of an organization that had trampled my rights was absurd. I told her I was seeking to stop the project altogether. Linda's face paled. She admitted that Damon and others had pushed the project through with questionable tactics. She confided she was trapped in a power struggle, forced to toe the line. This partial confession hinted at deeper corruption. I left without any agreement, but with renewed determination. On the drive home, a plan formed in my mind. I recalled grandfather's mention of the land's special status, which might hold more weight than I realized. If the land included a designated conservation area, there could be federal or state-level protections involved. My earlier discovery about the easement gave me hope that a higher authority might intervene, so I spent the afternoon contacting environmental agencies, explaining the situation, and emailing them scanned copies of the deed. If the construction threatened protected habitats or ran afoul of conservation laws, they might issue a stop-work order. It was a long shot, but worth trying. Days turned into a week. The noise outside never ceased. With each fresh shipment of steel, my anxiety grew. I wondered if I was too late, if the unstoppable machinery of the HOA would finish before any intervention. The pace of bureaucracy was notoriously slow. One morning, I stepped outside to find a formal notice tacked onto my fence, stating that a portion of my land had been acquired by the HOA via a quitclaim. Reading it made my blood run cold. They were attempting a forced easement, using documents with my allegedly forged signature. This was blatant fraud. I erupted in anger, yanking the notice off the fence. Then I realized anger alone wouldn't solve anything. I needed a strategic move. The memory of grandfather's old trunk nudged me again. There had to be something more in there, something that would deliver a knockout punch to the HOA's illegitimate claims. I rushed back inside, rummaging through the trunk's contents one more time. Beneath a stack of vintage postcards, I discovered an aged, official-looking document with an ornate seal. My pulse quickened as I recognized the signature of a county judge from 50 years ago. The document was a clarifying addendum to the original deed. It declared that any future structures of significant size must adhere to a rigorous environmental assessment, specifically because the area was recognized as a wildlife corridor. The creek that ran through our land was a migratory path for certain protected species of birds. I hadn't fully grasped the significance of this when I was younger. Now it was pure gold. This piece of paper could prove the HOA never had permission to erect something as massive as a bridge. If I delivered it to the right agency, the entire project could be doomed. Armed with this new revelation, I contacted a state environmental protection officer. I forwarded digital copies immediately, explaining that time was critical. The officer's voice on the phone hinted at genuine concern, particularly when I mentioned the protected birds. They promised to escalate the matter. Still, I knew how easily things could get tangled in bureaucracy. I needed something dramatic to force the HOA's hand. A phone call alone might not be enough. That's when I recalled how grandfather had once organized a community protest to save that ancient oak tree. Maybe raising public awareness would accelerate the official response. By afternoon, I had posted my story on social media, including photos of the bridge's encroachment, videos of the construction noise, and snapshots of the environmental documentation. I explained that the HOA was building without a proper permit, forging signatures and threatening a protected habitat. Within hours, the post gained traction. Local nature lovers expressed outrage. People from neighboring towns shared the post, condemning the HOA's arrogance. Even the local newspaper reached out for a statement. Momentum was building. If the HOA had wanted to keep this quiet, they had failed miserably. The tide was turning in my favor. Just then I heard a commotion outside. Stepping onto my porch, I spotted Damon himself, accompanied by two men in suits, walking the perimeter of the property. Their expressions were tense, eyes scanning the area as if searching for weaknesses. I approached cautiously, uncertain of their intentions. Damon greeted me with forced politeness, introducing the men as community mediators. They wanted to talk, insisting we could still find mutual benefit. I suppressed a bitter laugh. It was obvious the HOA sensed the rising public outcry. They likely hoped to silence me with a last-minute deal before regulators stepped in. I invited them inside, though my instincts screamed not to trust any of them. The men in suits spoke in careful, measured tones, describing the bridge as a beneficial project for everyone. They argued that removing it now would cost millions and disrupt local infrastructure. Damon chimed in, implying that if I persisted, the HOA might file lawsuits that could drain me financially. That was a transparent threat. My mind flashed to grandfather's unwavering grin whenever he talked about standing up to bullies. Summoning that courage, I slid the addendum across the table. The trio examined it, their faces darkening. "Where did you get this?" Damon snapped, looking genuinely rattled. I explained it was part of my family's deed. The suits whispered to each other, eyes flicking toward Damon. Then they asked if I'd consider letting the bridge stand if the HOA modified construction to satisfy environmental codes. I answered that it was too late for partial compliance. The structure as designed was fundamentally at odds with the protected corridor. That was the moment Damon lost his composure, launching into a tirade about me clinging to worthless land that offered no real benefits to anyone. His mask slipped, revealing raw contempt. I calmly told them to leave my house. They stormed out, but not before Damon declared, "This isn't over." My hands trembled slightly, adrenaline surging. I locked the door behind them, realizing I was in deeper than ever. The next morning, bulldozers rolled onto the construction site earlier than usual. The metallic groans and thuds intensified. They were obviously trying to complete as much as possible before any agency could intervene. The stress gnawed at me, but giving up now would dishonor everything grandfather had fought for. Instead, I doubled down, calling the environmental officer again, updating them on the new developments. Later that day, a small team of environmental inspectors arrived unannounced. I watched from my porch as they surveyed the site, cameras clicking. The construction crews looked uneasy, uncertain whether to keep working or pause. Damon hovered nearby, pacing and barking orders into his phone. Eventually, one of the inspectors approached him. They spoke in tense tones. By nightfall, a bright orange notice was posted on the main support beam of the bridge. A temporary stop work order. My heart soared at the sight. For the first time, I felt genuine hope that my land might be spared from this colossal intrusion. The local news soon arrived, filming the half-constructed bridge and interviewing neighbors. Mrs. Patterson and a few others bravely spoke on camera, describing how the HOA had pushed them around. They praised my effort to defend property rights and environmental protections. Online, more and more voices rallied to my cause. The HOA board, apparently feeling cornered, released a statement claiming they had always intended to work with local conservationists. The boldness of their lie astonished me, but it didn't matter. Proof of their forgery, along with the environmental concerns, was indisputable. The public was seeing their true colors. Days passed in relative quiet. The clang of construction halted, replaced by occasional visits from anxious HOA representatives. They tried different tactics, sweetening monetary offers, sending out mass letters to community members blaming legal red tape, and even hinting that I had orchestrated everything for personal gain. None of it stuck. The momentum for preserving the wildlife corridor grew. Several environmental groups threatened legal action if the HOA didn't dismantle the partial structure and restore the creek. The tide had turned so dramatically that I almost felt sorry for the more innocent employees, who simply wanted to finish their jobs. Then a new bombshell hit. A whistleblower from within the HOA leaked internal emails showing Damon and certain board members had knowingly expanded the project beyond the original permit scope. The emails also mentioned their plans to eventually build shops and offices near the bridge, effectively transforming the area into a lucrative commercial hub. That revelation outraged many local residents who had been led to believe the project was purely for community benefit. The scandal forced the HOA board into emergency sessions. Damon suddenly vanished from public view. Rumor had it he resigned or was asked to step down. Meanwhile, I was concerned about the partial steel structure left behind. Even if the HOA was forced to abandon the project, who would remove the ugly skeleton? Late one evening, as I walked the perimeter, I found pieces of twisted metal lying scattered. The incomplete bridge stood silent, an unfinished testament to arrogance. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity. The resources spent on this fiasco could have fixed roads or funded local schools, but greed and stubbornness had ruined any chance of that. Still, I had to focus on the steps necessary to reclaim and restore my land. A few weeks after the story broke wide, the final showdown came in the form of a public hearing at the county courthouse. Residents, environmental activists, and HOA representatives packed the chamber. Tensions ran high. I sat near the front, clutching a folder containing all the crucial documents, the original deed, the addendum, and evidence of forgery. An official from the Environmental Agency outlined how the project endangered several bird species reliant on the creek. The leaked emails were submitted into record, adding weight to the accusations of fraud. The presiding official glared at the HOA's legal team as they tried to argue in circles. When it was my turn to speak, I laid out my case with as much clarity and calm as I could muster. I explained my grandfather's legacy, our family's dedication to preserving the land, and the heartbreak of watching a steel monster rise without my consent. I concluded by requesting a formal order for the HOA to dismantle any parts of the structure encroaching on my property, to restore the creek's natural flow, and to cover the expenses for any environmental remediation. My pulse raced, but the supportive nods from onlookers gave me strength. The HOA's attorney stammered about procedural misunderstandings, citing some minor technicalities. Then Linda stepped forward, tears in her eyes, and confessed to the board's manipulative tactics. She confirmed they had never intended to get my permission legitimately. Her voice trembling, she admitted that forging my signature had been Damon's idea, carried out by individuals he hired. A hush fell over the room. I felt a flood of conflicting emotions, vindication, relief, and sadness that it had to come to this. The presiding official requested a brief recess, presumably to confer with the rest of the panel behind closed doors. After the recess, the official returned to announce their unanimous decision. The HOA had violated multiple regulations, including forging a signature on a county permit, breaching environmental protections, and illegally encroaching on private property. The partial bridge had to be dismantled at the HOA's expense, and they faced substantial fines for environmental damage. The official declared that I retained full rights to my land and suggested I could pursue additional civil action if I wished. Applause and cheers erupted from the crowd. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized the land would remain intact, just as grandfather had wanted. In the following days, I watched as trucks and cranes removed the steel segments piece by piece. It was a long, meticulous process, but each time a section came down, I felt a renewed sense of justice. Workers hauled away debris, eventually clearing the valley to reveal the creek and fields once again. Wildlife slowly returned, as if the land itself breathed a sigh of relief. Mrs. Patterson and a few of my other neighbors stopped by, bringing homemade pies and words of gratitude. My ordeal had become a symbol of standing against corporate or organizational overreach. The HOA's reputation took a major hit. New elections were held, and a wave of reformers replaced the old guard. Linda, though complicit, was given leniency for her honesty, but she chose to move away, saying she needed a fresh start. Damon remained out of sight, rumored to be facing criminal charges for fraud. Even the housing communities that originally wanted the bridge seemed relieved to be free of an association run by corrupt officials. The fiasco also sparked broader debates about how HOAs operate and what checks and balances should be in place to protect individual property owners. Meanwhile, I focused on repairing the land. I planted native grasses and small saplings to help stabilize the soil where the heavy machinery had churned it up. Local conservation groups assisted in rehabilitating the creek, ensuring that the migratory birds could nest safely. It felt like a new chapter, one written by my own determination and guided by grandfather's unseen hand. One day, while digging along the creek's edge to plant new seedlings, I unearthed a small metal box. Inside, I found old photographs of my grandfather, a younger version of my father, and me as a toddler. Written on the back of one photo was a note. To my family, remember, the land will always protect us if we protect it first. Those words echoed in my mind, reaffirming the promise I had made. Protecting this place wasn't merely about property lines or legal documents. It was about preserving a legacy that valued nature, community, and integrity. The twisted remains of the attempted bridge lingered in the local psyche, a cautionary tale of arrogance. Yet the land itself was healing. Animals roamed freely again, and the once scarred terrain began reclaiming its natural beauty. I felt at peace for the first time in months, knowing that I had fulfilled my grandfather's parting wish. Word spread that I was open to discussions about responsible, minimal-impact pathways for walkers or bicyclists, so long as they respected the environment and property rights. A newly formed residents' council reached out, ensuring any future plans would go through legitimate channels. They proposed a small nature trail with raised wooden walkways that wouldn't disrupt wildlife. This time they took every precaution, consulting environmental experts and me before drafting any proposals. The experience had clearly taught the community a collective lesson about transparency and mutual respect. Still, I remained vigilant. Bureaucracies and boards can change leadership, but sometimes old habits linger. Yet the momentum of this victory had sparked something in the local culture, a reminder that even one person could stand firm against powerful institutions, provided they hold truth on their side. And that truth was bolstered by documented evidence, public support, and an unwavering commitment to do what was right. Grandfather's spirit seemed to shine through every new leaf sprouting in the reclaimed valley. A few months after the final beam was removed, I received an official letter from the State Environmental Agency. It recognized our family's land as an important conservation site. They commended my efforts and even offered grants for ongoing habitat restoration. Though I wasn't sure if I'd accept government money, the gesture was touching. It validated that my grandfather's land held more than sentimental value. It had real ecological significance worthy of protection. Occasionally, people still asked why I bothered fighting so hard instead of taking a big payoff. Sometimes I would smile and say, "You can't put a price on legacy." Other times I'd relay stories of my grandfather's tenacity, the farmland's history, and the interconnected life that thrived here. People would often nod in understanding, especially when they saw the restored creek sparkling in the afternoon sun, the oak trees swaying gently, and the chorus of birds reclaiming the skies. As life settled back into a peaceful routine, I took a moment to reflect on how close I had come to losing everything. Without that crucial addendum in the trunk or the whistleblower's revelations, the HOA might have succeeded in permanently altering my land. It reminded me that vigilance is key, and that sometimes you have to dig deeper than expected, both literally and figuratively, to unearth the truth. The entire ordeal taught me to trust my instincts, rely on the power of community, and never underestimate the significance of well-kept family records. Of course, new challenges would arise in the future. Life never runs out of obstacles. But with the backing of supportive neighbors, ethical officials, and a renewed sense of purpose, I felt equipped to handle whatever might come next. The farmland once threatened by a monstrous bridge was now a symbol of resilience and unity. Generations from now, I hoped my children or grandchildren would inherit not just land, but the story of how it was saved, and hopefully they would carry on the tradition of safeguarding this place, understanding that sometimes heritage is our most powerful shield. Sometimes, on weekends, I'd stroll to the spot where the main support beam had once towered. A gentle slope led down to the creek, where wildflowers sprouted among soft grasses. If I closed my eyes, I could imagine the clang of metal and the roar of trucks. Then I'd open them to see the sun glinting off the water's surface, the wind rustling the reeds, and birds hopping along the bank. It was a stark contrast, a powerful reminder of how quickly greed can scar the land, but also how perseverance can heal it. I decided to put up a small wooden sign near that creek bend. It bore a simple engraving, "In honor of grandfather, may we always fight for what's right." That piece of cedar served as a quiet memorial, marking the boundary between the land's tumultuous recent past and its hopeful future. Visitors occasionally asked about the sign, and I'd tell them the saga, a condensed version of bridging attempts, legal showdowns, environmental alliances, and unwavering dedication. For many, it was just a curious anecdote about a local scandal, but for me, it was living history. The big question people always asked was, did you ever think about giving in? My honest answer was yes, more than once, especially when facing the HOA's well-funded legal threats. But I remembered grandfather's unyielding stance over that old oak tree, and each time I found a reason to keep fighting. When I discovered the forged signature, it was like a line in the sand. I knew if I let them trample over my rights then, I would forever regret betraying my family's trust. Accepting a payout would have been the easier road, but easy roads don't lead to fulfilling destinations. Over time, the valley's regeneration became an attraction for local schools studying ecology. Teachers brought students to observe how ecosystems recover from construction damage. We built a simple observation deck using recycled wood, set back from the creek so as not to disturb habitats. Children giggled as they spotted turtles and fish in the water, sometimes glimpsing a deer darting between the trees. Many of these kids were from the developments that once were supposed to be connected by the ill-fated bridge. Ironically, instead of forging a path of concrete, we were forming a path of education and communal respect. Outside organizations applauded the transformation. Some even wrote articles highlighting how a private citizen's resolve could trump an organization's might. "Local landowner stops bridge saves habitat," read a headline on an environmental blog. They interviewed me about how I orchestrated public support, used social media to expose wrongdoing, and leveraged historical documents to shut down an illegal project. I emphasized that it wasn't just me. Mrs. Patterson's research, the whistleblower's courage, the environmental officer's swift action, everyone played a pivotal role. My voice was merely a rallying cry, but it took many voices to change the outcome. One evening, I received a letter from an elderly man who recognized the name on my family deed. He introduced himself as a former farmhand who had known my grandfather decades ago. He'd heard about the bridge controversy and wanted to congratulate me on carrying the torch. The letter recounted a memory of grandfather standing in front of a bulldozer, refusing to move, determined to protect a patch of wildflowers. That small anecdote brought tears to my eyes. It was one more confirmation that I was on the right path, preserving not just the land, but the spirit behind it. Financially, the ordeal cost me time and resources I hadn't planned on spending. But ironically, the local sympathy that followed brought customers to the small produce stand I ran seasonally. People preferred buying fresh vegetables and honey from the farmer who fought the bridge. They appreciated the authenticity and the cause behind it. So, in an unexpected twist, the very thing that could have destroyed my land ended up boosting its profile. It became a local landmark for resilience, attracting kindred spirits who valued nature and community heritage. Life works in mysterious ways, doesn't it? Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of former HOA members driving by, looking both curious and sheepish. Some offered tentative waves, perhaps regretting their past complicity or simply relieved to see the place thriving. The new leadership in the HOA approached me with a sincere apology. They invited me to speak at a community event about responsible land stewardship. I agreed, on the condition that they remain transparent about any future developments that might affect local ecosystems. It was a strange feeling stepping onto a stage funded by the same organization that had once threatened to ruin my legacy. But progress sometimes unfolds through uncomfortable reckoning. Standing before that audience, I recounted the entire journey, how I discovered forged signatures, scrambled through old documents, rallied neighbors, and persisted in the face of intimidation. A hush fell when I described the heartbreak of seeing my grandfather's cherished fields overshadowed by a steel behemoth. Then I shared how the land was rebounding, how the birds had returned, and how the real reward was knowing we'd done the right thing. The crowd applauded, and I silently thanked Grandfather, wherever he was, for guiding my steps. Eventually, the day came when the county officially recognized my family's property as a historical site tied to early conservation efforts. A small ceremony took place, with local officials unveiling a bronze plaque near the oak tree that Grandfather once saved. It read, "Protected Land, Legacy of Stewardship." My name was there too, alongside Grandfather's, marking the generational bond that had safeguarded this patch of earth. For me, that moment was surreal. Instead of a massive concrete bridge overshadowing our creek, we now had a plaque celebrating the very values Grandfather taught me to cherish. After the ceremony, I found a quiet spot under that oak tree. Light filtered through the leaves, creating dancing patterns on the ground. I placed a hand on the trunk, feeling the rough bark beneath my palm. In my mind, I thanked Grandfather for all the lessons, big and small. This entire saga had turned from a conflict into a testimony of how moral courage, backed by evidence, can triumph over even the most imposing obstacles. I stayed there for a while, letting the breeze carry away any lingering bitterness. What remained was gratitude for having stood my ground. Time passed, seasons changed, but the memory of that half-built bridge never fully faded. It became part of local lore, a story recounted by hikers passing through. Some people whispered that the creek was haunted by the ghosts of heavy machinery. Others turned it into a cautionary tale about shady HOAs. While the comedic exaggerations made me chuckle, the heart of the story was rooted in truth. Always read the fine print, keep your eyes open, and never underestimate the importance of protecting your rights. Our world can shift in unexpected ways, but some principles must remain unshakable. Occasionally, late at night, I'd wake from a dream where bulldozers resumed their assault. My heart would thunder, only to calm when I realized it was just a memory. The hush of the farmland lulled me back to sleep, and each new sunrise reminded me that a single individual, armed with perseverance and facts, can stand up to seemingly unstoppable forces. Sometimes you just need the quiet voice of a past generation, like my grandfather's echo, telling you not to back down. Let the cynics sneer, let the powerful threaten. None of that matters if you're rooted in principle. Eventually, even the talk of lawsuits subsided. The HOA accepted its fines, restructured, and tried to salvage its reputation by hosting community cleanups and nature awareness events. A few cynical voices claimed it was all PR to repair their image. Regardless, positive results emerged. Local parks got fresh funding, they started offering grants for eco-friendly landscaping, and more property owners felt empowered to challenge questionable mandates. The fiasco thus yielded a silver lining, making people think twice before signing away their property rights. Though my personal battle concluded, its ripple effects might keep resonating for years to come. One afternoon, I spotted an unfamiliar face wandering near the creek with a camera and notebook. Approaching cautiously, I discovered he was a freelance writer working on a piece about unusual local landmarks. He wanted the scoop on that big infamous bridge fiasco. I walked him through the highlights, pointing out where the steel supports had once stood. He asked why I hadn't just taken the offered bribe. I told him the same thing I told everyone. Some things are bigger than money. He nodded, pen scribbling furiously. By the time he left, he seemed inspired by what a single voice could accomplish. Life returned to its gentle rhythm. Crops continued to grow, and the creek babbled peacefully. On weekends, I'd join small volunteer groups removing invasive plants or teaching kids about local wildlife. I tried to pay forward the help I had received by offering guidance to others facing property disputes. Check your records, consult community members, and Don't underestimate the power of documentation, I would advise. People often expressed surprise that an average person could successfully stand up to well-funded boards. But that was the real lesson. None of us are truly average when we're propelled by conviction. Occasionally, I still opened grandfather's trunk, reading his notes and letters. One tattered envelope contained a single slip of paper with a handwritten quote, "In every battle of principle, stand like a rock." It struck me that grandfather must have known I'd face such a test one day, or maybe he was simply passing along wisdom, not knowing how crucial it would become. Either way, I clung to those words. They reminded me that no matter how sophisticated or intimidating an opposing force seems, unwavering resolve remains a formidable shield. Looking back, I recognized the many layers of conflict that had converged: personal attachment to family land, environmental laws, community politics, and the moral stance against fraud. That multifaceted struggle taught me that issues are rarely black and white. Even Linda, who started as an antagonist, ended up a conflicted whistleblower. People are complicated. Some choose ethics under pressure, others double down on wrongdoing. My job wasn't to judge them forever, but to make sure their deeds were held accountable so the rightful outcome prevailed. When visitors asked about the single biggest factor that secured my win, I often answered, documentation. Without grandfather's addendum and the original deed, I'd have been stuck in endless arguments. Words are powerful, but legal documents anchor them in reality. That small piece of knowledge proved crucial. It also made me wonder how many injustices thrive simply because people lack proof or remain unaware of their rights. If there's one universal takeaway, it might be that vigilance, knowledge, and courage must work in tandem to guard what's precious. In quieter moments, I felt a profound sense of responsibility for this land. I realized that every foot of soil, every leaf, and every creature is part of a larger tapestry that we're privileged to share. We don't own nature, we steward it. When big organizations wield their influence recklessly, they can rip threads out of that tapestry. But individuals, grounded in respect, can mend those tears. That understanding shaped how I viewed every new day, as a chance to protect and nurture, to ensure that future generations inherit something worth cherishing. Finally, the day arrived when official notice came that all charges against me had been dropped. No countersuits, no nuisance claims, no further harassment from the HOA. They had recognized the futility of challenging my rightful ownership and the environmental statutes. At sunset, I took a leisurely walk through the fields, letting the golden light wash over me. The orchard trees rustled gently. Crickets began their evening chorus. I felt the land's heartbeat align with mine, and in that tranquil moment, I saw grandfather's grin in the shifting shapes of the clouds. Reflecting on everything, I drew a deep breath and let my worries fade. From a legal standpoint, it was over, but the deeper resolution was internal. I had proven to myself that the convictions passed down through my family were not just old tales. They were living truths, ready to be tested and defended. Standing there, I whispered a private thanks to my grandfather for instilling in me both the will to fight and the wisdom to seek help when needed. My victory was our victory, past, present, and future generations standing guard over this land. And so if you ever find yourself confronting an impossible challenge, remember this story. Sometimes the biggest battles are won by piecing together old documents in a dusty trunk, by speaking out even when the odds seem stacked, and by holding firm to what's right, no matter how loud the machinery roars. In the end, after all the noise has settled, truth stands unshaken. That is the essence of my tale, the promise my grandfather made real, and the heartbeat of every victory ever earned through honest perseverance. So here we are, at the final word of my journey, hoping that this story resonates. We saved the creek, preserved the land, and forced the dismantling of that massive bridge. The new seeds we planted are thriving, much like the lessons learned. Let this be a reminder that vigilance and integrity can triumph. After all, your deepest roots, once discovered, hold the power to topple even the tallest tower of steel. The moral? Stand your ground, backed by truth and determination, for only then can you protect what truly matters. That's the legacy we carry forward.